Well, good morning and welcome to today's SVDX webinar. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I am Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange, and we are delighted to have you with us today. I know this is a busy time of year for everybody, both personally and professionally, so we do appreciate your time this morning. It's really my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar on our hot topics for board governance, what to expect in 2025. I will do very brief introductions, and then we will get started on today's session. Jennifer Dulski is currently CEO and founder of Rising Team, a team performance platform that helps companies boost employee engagement and manager effectiveness. Prior to Rising Team, she held executive roles at Facebook, Google, Yahoo, and Change.org. She has deep board experience in public and private companies and nonprofits, and currently serves as the lead independent director at Arcadia, a climate tech company. Her public board experience includes Weight Watchers, Tegna, and Move Inc. And one fun fact about Jen that I wanted to point out is she was just in the Wall Street Journal last week for a wonderful article about women bosses. So go check that out. Ryan Howrahan is a managing director with Pearl Meyer. He has over 10 years of experience advising boards and senior management on incentive compensation design, corporate governance, and performance measurement with the objective of supporting business strategy, value creation, and shareholder interests. His clients have included Fortune 500 organizations, privately held companies, and pre-IPO ventures across an array of industries. David Larker is the James Irvin Miller Professor of Accounting Emeritus at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He is also the director of the Corporate Governance Research Initiative at Stanford Graduate School of Business, senior faculty of the Arthur and Tony Rembe Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University, and distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Larker's research focuses on executive compensation, corporate governance, and managerial accounting, and his most recent book, written with Brian Tyan, is The Art and Practice of Corporate Governance. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur, and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. Today's webinar will be 1 hour in length. We encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A button on Zoom, and we will do our best to get to them. We will be covering a variety of topics today, so this will be a very full 1 hour. And I just want to say thank you again to Jen, David, Ryan, and Dan for your time and expertise today. We are looking forward to a fun and engaging session. Dan, you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Nancy. It is truly a pleasure to have Jen and Ryan and Dave on this webinar. No introduction can really do them justice. All of Ryan's juicy stuff is confidential, so we can't even say which are the latest and most exciting clients he's doing cool stuff for. But I can say Dave is among the most prolific corporate governance writers and influencers anywhere, and despite his claims to be retiring or trying to retire or sort of retiring, his productivity seems to increase over time. And Jen also teaches at Stanford GSB and has written books and done some great stuff. So we're really lucky to have the three of you here. Ryan, we're gonna get you to spill some beans. Maybe don't name names, but give us some real juicy current examples of what's going on. Let's start out by maybe just level setting with a concept that is a sort of meta hot topic. And Dave, I'm going to turn to you for it. And it is the idea that, it's not new, but I think maybe some people have doubled down on this idea, and you might be among them, that the role of the director, particularly the public company director, has not just evolved, but fundamentally changed. It's bigger, it's more involved. And then there are some places where you can see some directors and how they are supported and how they act that really sets a very high bar. And I don't know if we're saying that that's the bar we're supposed to aim for, but I wonder if you could comment on if you think that is true and some of the key elements of this new evolving super director role and standard and how hard it's getting.
Yeah, let me just kick it off, and obviously Jen and Ryan weigh in on this. I don't think we all agree, which is probably a good thing for the conversation. But yeah, I think my sense in being on boards and consulting with boards is that I think institutional investors in particular, but also retail investors are starting to look at are the boards working kind of hard enough and smart enough? And I think they're kind of raising the bar, saying, you got to spend more time really understanding the company, spend more time getting to know people below the C-suite and things like that. And so my sense is going forward, what we're going to see is demands that directors, up their game and know a lot more about the business. And I guess as an example, we've done a number of articles with Value Add Capital, which is a San Francisco company. I would say they're kind of constructive activists, and they've kind of opened up a little bit. And what's impressive about what they do is, they spend, a year, 2 years, whatever, researching a company, and then take a position in the company, and kind of try to instill some change. And when they're on the board, I would say they have the traditional board book, but they also have deep insight into the research that they've done. Now, of course, they have a big staff that supports the director, but I would say they're really, really expert in what's going on and have real opinions based on that. So I think going forward, I think, it's kind of what I kind of call the super director. I don't know if it's a good term or not, but I think we're going to move in that direction where I think people are going to demand more out of the directors in terms of what's going on in the company. And maybe we'll get to this, maybe not, but I think AI is actually going to help out along these lines, helping distill competitive information and other sorts. But of course, the whole thing from a director standpoint, you still have your fiduciary duties. And then there's the issue of when is it that you're managing the company and when is it you're being a board member? That line becomes very, very sort of murky. So I think we're going to see some analysis and thinking about this, but I think what's going forward, I think it's going to be hard to be on lots of different boards, and I think the demands are going to be higher. So let me just leave it at that for now.
That's great, Dave. I do want to invite Jen and Ryan to maybe jump in with this idea that is the nose in, fingers out kind of true, but it's like nose way in and maybe like your eyes are in and fingers are generally like, yeah. I mean, Jen, Ryan, what do you think? I like Dave's thesis. I've observed it as well, but I'm sure, there's room to have a different view. Jen, you want to go first? Maybe just
Sure. A couple points here. So first of all, I do agree things are getting more complex. And so at a minimum, boards are going to need to spend more time to understand those things. I think there are 2 points that I want to point out here. One is there are investor board members and there are independent board members, especially when you talk about private company boards. And even as you get into public company boards, depending on who takes those seats. So I do agree with you in this sort of investor board member approach that the more, investors are focused on performance for their LPs and so forth, the more deep they want to go. And I see that even on the private board that I chair right now. And it's actually, sometimes it can be good and sometimes it can be bad because there are intense demands on management from this kind of board oversight. And sometimes I think that's helpful and sometimes not. So what I'm trying to encourage on our board is if you are the investor that wants to go super deep or needs to go super deep on these things, please try to make that a service to the rest of the board rather than making it a demand on every board member to do that, in-depth review. And that way it can also be less of a burden on management to make sure everybody's educated at the same level. The other piece is that for sort of operator board members, which I have always been, they come with a different set of knowledge and experience that maybe makes it easier for them to be as deep in the business. And that's slightly harder for investors to do. So I think about when I was on the Move Inc. Board, which was the owner of Realtor.com, a big real estate company. I had just come from Yahoo where I ran the real estate business. Like it was deep knowledge for me already. And so much easier for me to go deep on those things. So I think part of it is what's the makeup of the board and what do people already know and not know? And also how do we balance the benefits of going super deep with the demands that causes on the company?
And Ryan, I want to turn to you before I do that. It's interesting, Dave, you hinted at this, and Jen, you've just outlined it. This definitely impacts that line between, you know, the board's role and management, and it makes it blurrier. So it at the very least, I think you both agree that it makes it harder to manage that difference the more deep a director becomes immersed in terms of like knowledge, involvement, et cetera. But turning to you, Ryan, real quick, and I don't mean to put you into a, you know, particular corner of comp, but like, you know, comp increasingly, if it's whether it's incentive structures or goals or whatever, you know, directors need to know more and more about how the company works at the detail level in a lot of ways in order to satisfy, it seems to me anyway, certain objectives around how they design comp. But like, what's your observation, big picture, about this demand on directors?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would echo what Jen and David have said. I certainly, you know, over my 15 years or so in the boardroom, have certainly seen the attention to detail and some of the deeper understanding of the organization grow over time. You're seeing that even manifest itself in the names of some of these committees. Instead of the comp committee, it's the human capital and compensation committee. So, you know, you're seeing that role expand. I will also say another area that I've seen a lot of my boards starting to roll up their sleeves and get a little bit more involved is on the succession planning side, and really putting an onus on understanding the business. And to Dave's point earlier, not just the executive level, a few levels deep, understanding where the bench strength is, understanding where there's a lack of bench strength. And I don't see that going anywhere. Now, unfortunately, you haven't seen director comp tick up with the increased focus. So, you know, while you see executive comp kind of on that 4 to 5% increase year over year, director comp has kind of been in that lower single digits. I will say also, with some of the increased emphasis on understanding the organization, some of the increased risk associated with all the thing, I've also seen from some of my clients, the time to fill open director roles is taking much longer than it had previously. And this kind of speaks to Jen's previous point, is really trying to understand the makeup of the board. And, you know, do we have specific expertise in specific areas, and really being a little bit more strategic in that regard, which is creating kind of, you know, a little bit more time lapse in terms of, you know, filling open director roles.
That's great. All right. Well,
yeah, could I just follow up a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So I thought Jen made a really good point. You know, let's say we go down this path where there's, you know, call it a couple super directors. The social dynamics of the boardroom are going to be really different, right? Because, you know, it's like, well, you're a super director, and now you got a half a dozen other people that don't have that expertise. How is it shared? You know, does it allow power to be distributed in an unusual or inappropriate way? Things like that. So that have to be worked out. But I think, you know, some of the electronic tools that are out there now are going to help, but the board's got to buy into that. And, you know, people just can't, you know, be in a silo. They have the information and they're using it in just say, an inappropriate way. So good, really good point, Jim.
Yeah, no, Dave, it's a great point, and I think I'll invite you guys to readdress it when we get to the AI section. But a basic point might be, if a super director gets the board book, but then also has a special board book, one would wonder, should that special board book be a part of the board book? Like, you know, so like, we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to kind of some of those dynamics. So at the very least, getting to the kind of hot topics, big issues, we're going to talk next about DEI, the pendulum of DEI and rollback, how it, you know, what are the dynamics around that, particularly as concern the board. We're going to try to talk about engagement around political issues. And this is something, Dave, that we've talked about before at SVDX. It's a very, you know, consistent hot topic around what to do and how to manage it at the board level when CEOs and or companies take positions or don't take positions on certain matters. And then we're going to get to CEO pay packages, probably talk a little bit about the Tesla case, and hopefully work from home issues. And then we've got a couple more, including AI. So we'll see how we make it through, encourage people to ask us questions. But let me just jump straight into the next topic, which is the DEI current frame and the arguable rollback that is happening at certain companies. My question is this accurately stated or overstated? Is this something that only really is going to use up the mind share of directors at certain companies, or is it really broad spectrum? And how might directors think about that? Jen, I'll kind of invite you to kick it off, though I want everyone to kind of weigh in on this one because I think there's a lot of good viewpoints.
Yeah, and actually David and Ryan may have better perspective here on the breadth of what they're seeing at different boards. What I would say from my perspective, I have a core belief that companies should do the right things to make their employees feel valued and seen and understood in the workplace. My company works on that principle. And so I think that is independent of DEI, the sort of people side of DEI. And it is true that we saw a big spin up, in the post George Floyd era, that I think was a lot of talk and very little real action. And employees felt that too. And so I think this kind of rollback of we're saying a lot and not doing a lot is actually probably okay. The interesting thing will be, how this all impacts. Again, where does the board role sit here is the question, because I think management teams have a lot of decisions to make about what you do both internally and externally. And those two things probably should be separate discussions and separate decisions. Whether the board has a role in either one of those, I think is a decent question. And I'm not sure, like to the degree that they believe it is a fiduciary impact to the company, i.e. will we lose customers? Will we start seeing massive employee attrition? Then it becomes, I think, a board role, or to the degree that boards are still ESG focused on the whole, then maybe it is. But I also think this could be one of those, could be kind of a lark that boards should just kind of stay out of this and let companies figure out where to settle in as this evolves over time. That may be it.
That's great. And before I pull David, I may ask a follow-up question, Jen, but let me ask Ryan. You spent a lot of time with the newly named, human capital and compensation committees. And what have you seen in this regard, even at the granular level? Like, some companies were setting goals that were DEI centric, and is that evolving? How does that look? And then Dave, I'm going to ask you to give us kind of some big picture stuff, but Ryan, you go first.
Yeah, from the compensation perspective, I certainly think, to Jen's point, post George Floyd, there was kind of a push to maybe bake some more DEI specific metrics into the executive incentive program, really to portray to shareholders that this is something we're taking seriously, even if the percentage attributed to those metrics were pretty minor in the grand scheme of the overall incentive. I think you're starting to see companies back away from a DEI metric. Now, I'll say that with a caveat. I have a lot of clients that are in, climate impacted industries, meaning transportation, logistics. Those clients will still think, utilize ESG metrics. So I put ESG under the DEI bucket, yeah. But, it's not necessarily focused on the diversity portion of it. It's more, let's get the ESG side of this and make sure we're focused on that. That said, if you look at S&P 500, you're still seeing a slight uptick in kind of DEI, ESG related metrics, but I would expect that the momentum there slows down fairly significantly. And I've seen some of my clients, in fact, pull back on some of the not DEI initiatives, to Jen's point, in the organization, but making it a focal point of the executive incentive and those kind of things, just because it's often fairly subjective. A lot of times the process in place to manage success or failure under DEI, because it's not something that's been tracked necessarily for a tremendous amount of years. It's just a pretty opaque, what does success or failure look like under some of these metrics? And it's pretty hard to discern sometimes. So I think you're seeing some companies kind of move away from some of the momentum that was there a couple of years ago.
And you make a really good point, Ryan, which is I probably overly narrowed the question by saying DEI only. If you expand it to ESG and DEI writ large, I think it's both a more complicated issue, and there's certain elements that are not arguably at certain companies being, rolled back, and other places where they're moving forward. Dave, what with this slightly larger frame in mind, ESG and DEI, what would you say our directors have to be paying attention to, if at all, in this coming year at a kind of practical level?
Yeah, so we might as well start with a little controversy, and it's early, but let's do it. But so I view these as super important questions for society and how it comes down to boards. And I think the whole ESG thing, stakeholder issues, people got really excited about it, and I think there was a lot of bad research, bad discussion, and lack of data, and it was on everybody's plate. What are we going to do about it? And then people started looking at it a little more carefully. And really, a lot of these assertions just weren't supported when you look at the data. And then I think it came to the realization this is not free to make these choices. I mean, if you invest in DEI or climate or whatever, it's going to be costly for the company, and it's not necessarily a win-win in terms of shareholders. And I think we're having a more reasonable conversation about that. And we've done a bunch of surveys at Hoover and the GSB about how people are really backing off, both institutional investors and retail investors, how they're really backing out of the ESG focus. Now, I think it's going to come back when we have more sensible views and frameworks about this, but it's not going to go away. But I think the hype has certainly backed off. So with DEI, and we've done a bunch of stuff. We recently published a paper called Diversity Washing, and basically there's a bunch of companies out there that are hyping their DEI and are doing nothing internally, where we know exactly what the diversity looks like, and it's pretty interesting. Now, maybe that's not so surprising to people that are in the real world, but the extent of it is pretty immense. And we just finished a paper about what happens when a company gets sort of slapped with a DEI criticism, either a lawsuit or shareholder amendments or things like that, or just bad press. What's really interesting is they basically, I would say, do nothing as a function of these things. And I don't think this is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. But what happens is, post George Floyd, et cetera, you saw the new people coming in were diverse, either in terms of ethnicity or gender, but it's at the very lowest part of the organization, and if you went further up, we kind of divided it into 5 levels of the organization. There's almost nothing going on above that. And that's true whether you appoint a chief diversity officer or, there's a bunch of hype and rhetoric. There's nothing, on average, nothing much is happening inside the organization. And then if you look at it going forward, the lowest level people that come in, it's not like they had a career path for them where they're rising through the organization. And companies sort of hypes to say, 90% of our people that we hired this year were diverse, but it wasn't like they had a career path going into even low level management. And so I do think it's a board level issue. I think you want to know what people are doing. And I think you want to be careful about what you claim to the outside, because people are going to look at that and say, if you're not backing us up, as Dan knows better than the rest of it, that could give rise to various lawsuits, and they're ready law firms that are happy to sue you over this. So again, I think it's really important. I think it's important for the boards and the companies to look more like what the population looks like. But I think we got to get realistic about this. And, I'm not a big regulatory person, but, was there a market failure in terms of forcing companies to get a little more diverse? Maybe, but I guess we'll see with the new election results. We'll see what happens in the SEC and in Congress. So.
Well, Dave, you highlighted a couple key things, which I might ask Jen to weigh in on. But one is an issue around consistency, of message and internal activity, and kind of having the board pay attention to what the claims are and what's actually happening internal. I mean, that's kind of a classic oversight consistency thing.
No, that's right.
But I wonder if Jen, and you might say something else, but I wonder if you might comment on the brand risk authenticity issue that emerges. I know you pay attention to those kind of things, but tell me what you were going to say first, and then I'll ask my follow-up question. I'm the father of 2 Gen Zs, and from a market viewpoint, authenticity is everything. So I might make us come back to that question. But go ahead.
Well, I completely agree with that. I'm also the mother of 2 Gen Zs, as you know. So yes, I think there is, and this is what I was trying to say before, is that the board should get involved when you believe there's either an impact, real impact to customers and brand reputation and so forth, or employee attrition, retention, et cetera. And so I think Dave makes a very good point on this part. The all talk, no action. You gave a very good example of that, of we say we're hiring these diverse people and then we bring in a bunch of junior people with no career path and so forth. The best companies here, and I think where boards can add value, is helping the companies where they sit on boards to become the best companies. They actually have a plan. Like, the truth is, it is very hard to have senior, C-suite diversity unless you have a plan through the whole organization. Like, having run engineering organizations for a large part of my life, I just know that's the case. And so, as an example, even at my own company, when we started it, I hired two, on a team of 6, I hired 2 junior women engineers, because I knew that if I wanted senior women engineers, I had to bring them in as junior folks and grow them, because it's not that there's no pool, but the pool is smaller. And so, companies, I think, who have a strategy to do it that way, and the boards can help and guide them, can be really successful. If you don't, then I think you risk exactly what you're talking about. And of course, Nancy mentioned it at the beginning, but I used to be president of change.org, and I saw many, many brands go down from consumer campaigns. So it's not just lawsuits, which are very risky, but boards need to keep track of, are customers going to get upset and be in the press and start to get loud about this stuff? And, I agree, David, that right now we're seeing kind of a dip in this, where boards can get away with doing nothing, even if they get a lot of risky press. But I think that tends to go in waves. And while I hate it, the truth is, we will have another George Floyd moment, and we shouldn't just do the right thing when we're forced to. We should really try to do the right thing, because not just because we feel it's morally right, but also there's a lot of data that says that, for instance, diverse companies perform a lot better. And so as boards, I think holding companies accountable to that makes sense.
Can I just jump in here? So here's what I would, the participants here and people are listening, you really want to be evidence-based here. You want to be very careful about what you're assuming. So there's a lot of work out there that suggests there might be an initial short-term pop if you're, if you embrace diversity, and, you get a short-term pop and, people that are coming to work for you or customers. I don't think there's hardly any evidence there's a long-term benefit to this. And I'm not making a personal statement. It's just pure on data. And I think you want to be very careful of thinking that diversity does really translate into, let's say, financial performance. There could be a lot of other performance that improves. The evidence is very, very spotty on this. And I'm not trying to be depressing about this, but I think we want to be realistic about what you would expect. But what works on average, which I'm talking about, and what works for you as a company can be quite different. But you want to press people, when they, consultants or whatever, when they come in and say, hey, diversity is just going to cause your organization to perform a lot better. Maybe, but I think you want to be careful about just taking it at face value.
Yeah, Dave, your controversial edge is losing its edge. I think what you're saying is, that board members, it ties back to the very first point we start out with. Board members need to be thoughtful, cautious, and evidence-based. Every company is different, and hence any generic solution or generic claim should be evaluated in the context of the actual company's situation, and tie that up with what both, Ryan and Jen said, and that is that there are lots of factors to consider, and a board at the very least should look for consistency, oversight, and a plan, right? Like, so yeah, Dave, I think you are consistent in saying, don't just do stuff because someone told you it worked. You should probably make sure it actually is going to do what you meant to do, and that it creates shareholder value.
Or even because you're getting pressure from consumers. I will say, I just want to weigh in, because I do think there's data that there is benefit from diversity in business performance, at least in the C-suite and the board level. There's data that suggests that. I don't know about DEI programs per se, but
yeah, we could have a conversation offline, but I think it's not as definitive. But
okay,
let
we
me just
should.
leave it at that. Yeah,
And I love it that the two people teaching
Gender, for instance.
SVD are having this debate. But yeah, the empirical work is hard. Really consistent, high quality empirical work is even harder. so there is room, I think, for debate. But I think the takeaways for directors are pretty clear, right? Which is, assess in the context of your own company. Don't take generic, guarantees as anything useful. Perhaps you should be more consistent in terms of what you say and what you do. And if you're going to do something, do it to a plan and have it mapped to strategic objectives. I mean, like, these are all things that you just said, and those are fairly uncontroversial. We'll come back to it a little bit because this is a good
let me just make, I'm sorry, Dan, but like, I think if you're on a board and you built a DEI program and you got a chief diversity officer, and then you unravel it, it's a strange place to be, right? And I'm thinking about, Walmart's recent discussion, and then, Tractor Supply, Harley Davidson, a few other companies. I mean, you put it in, you touted it, and now you're taking it out. I think that's a very awkward position for a board to be in. And we'll see how many other companies going forward, actually do this. But the Walmart thing, I kind of viewed it as, it's not a niche company. I mean, it's a big company with, big human capital. And if they're backing out of this, what does that tell about what's likely to show up after the first of the year with companies and their DEI focus?
So there's a question that popped up, which I'm going to roll into the conversation around talent in just a minute. But I'd love to segue this into the broader political discussion. So one of the concepts that, Dave, you sort of pioneered as an area of study for boards was, how should boards think about the political positioning of the company, B, their executives, which implies company positioning, and all the complexity that comes with that? Should it be a default to avoid it? Should it be acknowledgement that CEOs are people who might step into that fray regardless? There's a lot of moving parts. I'd like us to talk about that, and we can include in that the kind of changing of viewpoints, right? So DEI, if treated as a political matter, which it clearly is not just a political matter, in fact, maybe it isn't at its core a political matter, is something where, Harley Davidson's a good example, is reversing itself. Others have reversed themselves. But Dave, can you kick us off by just stating more broadly, what should boards be at the very least attuned to with regards to political opinion engagement at the company or executive level?
Yeah, it's a good question for sure. And I think we go backward, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. I think boards were sort of shocked sometimes by the CEOs out there talking about the NRA, or, weighing in on healthcare issues and things like that. And then I think after those things happened, I think smart boards, got together and said, do we want our CEO, or anybody on the board making these statements? And I think it's a contract that you cut with the CEO. And it's like, we don't want to be surprised in the paper or you just took a hard stance on something that's controversial. Or let's have a sensible and rational assessment. Why do we want to do that? And, it could be, this is what we're about culturally, and we want to do it. And, there's some stances where maybe you don't want to weigh in on these things. Jen talked about it's going to have an impact on customers and potential employees and things like that. I think that's really true. But I think boards, I don't think there's a one answer here. It's just, the board has to say, do we want to do this? If so, what's the cost and benefits of this? And then let's not get surprised about it. But, our research has been, there's certain things that, shareholders or customers, think it's okay for the CEO to weigh in on. And there are things that are related to the business. Here's things that, like, I'm sure there's going to be people weighing in on tariffs and how it affects us and things like that. But they don't want CEOs weighing in on very controversial things, and maybe the most controversial, issues with regard to religion or things like that. So there's certain areas I think are fine. But I think the board has to kind of figure out, do you want the CEO out there discussing these things in open forum or not? And of course, some CEOs are better at that than others. And so let me just leave it at that.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put Jen on the spot and just ask from kind of just because of your background. There's another direction this impulse for taking a position comes from, and that is from employees at large, right? You get a demand that says, as a company, employees want a statement from the CEO or a statement from the board that we are not going to fill in the blank. So take a real example coming up. There'll be lots of interesting, complicated moving parts with respect to a deportation program if the Trump administration goes down that path. And it'll implicate vendors of all sorts and certain, rights that, employers could choose or not to choose to allow inspections of a certain type, and there'll be lots of stuff. And it feels like there might be an upswell from certain types of companies. Is probably demographically based. If you got a bunch of young 20-somethings who are, educated in certain parts of the country all together, they're probably going to be motivated to say, take a position. So Jen, can you talk a little bit about that angle of it? Like, I like Dave's point, and I want to marry it to your view where sometimes it bubbles up. So what do boards do in that regard?
Definitely. I mean, we saw this already with the war in Gaza, right? Employees striking and so forth against their company policies and protesting and so forth. So it definitely is happening. I agree completely with Dave's point about no surprises. Like, what the board wants is no surprises. And so on that front, it makes sense to try to agree on some norms or policies with the CEO and the management team. My policy has always been, take a stand on what you stand for. Like, if your company has a set of mission and values and so forth, and only, if you start putting your foot in the water and making political statements on everything that happens, you get in a ton of trouble. Like, when I do remember this, even as an operator, when I was at Change, it was during the first Trump presidency, and the Muslim ban came out, and our employees were furious and wanted us to make a statement, and we didn't. And we said, what we stand for is amplifying all people's voices, whatever they are, and, feel free to start petitions and so forth. But part of the reason we didn't is because our employees in Russia at the time were saying, well, why aren't you taking a stand on this issue that we're seeing here? And so you get in this very slippery slope of having to say something about everything. Whereas if you stick to your company values and core mission, it becomes much more clear. So Patagonia, as an example, very well known for environmental issues. If something comes up on the environment, they should speak up. If something comes up around other issues, ideally they can hold back, because it's just really tough. And what I would say from a board perspective, and we talked about this a little bit earlier amongst ourselves, but there's a real difference between founder CEOs and hired CEOs on this point. And so in terms of the no surprises rule, one thing to think about as you potentially join boards is just, when you join a board that is still founder led, the board will have a lot less ability to control what that person says or does. And you can see the most extreme example, right, in Elon and a few others that we all know well. And so I think with a hired CEO, it's a lot easier to kind of create those sets of norms, and it would be a good idea, wise to do that. And founder-led companies, of which I'm one too, I think it's a little bit harder to control there.
No, that makes sense. I mean, so it sounds like at the very least, boards need to have taken the time to establish those norms and or negotiated policies, right? So that norm will manifest, perhaps, Dave, in your words, as a contract arrangement or an understanding that has clarity between, the CEO and the board. And with regards to those other issues, setting out when you do and you don't weigh in, Jen, in advance of having the, something land in front of you, wherever it may come from, makes it a lot easier for the board to sort that out.
But this is pretty new. I mean, the employee activism, which I think can occur almost instantaneously now. It used to be, in the old day, water cooler talk, but now you have Slack and other things, and things can, heat up almost instantaneously. I mean, I think the board, needs to do some tabletop exercises around, let's say you get one of these things, what do? You want to think through it, and, I mean, it's, some of these things are pretty complicated to grapple with. And, So, Jen brought up another good point that and this is the ESG, DEI kind of thing. Let's say a company wants to embrace some of those things and you pick out two or three. There's another 100 or 1,000 things where you have to say, well, why didn't you do anything on these things, right? And then what do you say, if you're on the board and, you pick out some of these things, but, it's a different world along these lines. And then, the other issue is if you give money or support, do you actually try to get some information on was there any impact and was it desirable? I think there's been a lot of controversy on the funds that went into Black Lives Matter and other kinds of things that have the impact that we wanted. And so this is actually quite new in boardrooms. It's not the same old. And so we'll see.
Ideally, I love the tabletop exercises idea. And I think when I said you want kind of norms set between board and management, the best version of this is also the leadership of companies making those norms and expectations and plans clear to the employee base.
Right.
So the employees also know this is why we speak up. This is when we speak up. We're not going to speak up on all these other things. It doesn't necessarily mean we don't feel a certain way, but this is strategic for us as a company and here's why we do it. And I think the more you can have that communication, the less random activism you'll get because employees can understand the reasoning. Like employees tend to act out when they in a vacuum, right? So don't give them a vacuum.
So let me tease that out a little bit. Between tabletop exercises and embracing the complexity of this issue that is emergent, right? Addressing political issues that arise in one context or another. This sounds very time consuming for a board to manage. Clearly it should not be ignored based on this discussion. Do you have any advice about how to clear room for a board to do this? And I'm gonna tie this back to the question that we got about the DEI. So the DEI question was, gosh, if there's not good evidence about that, that's interesting. I want to understand and hear more about that. And then the follow-up was, if there's no good evidence about enhancing the interest of the shareholder, either profitability, sustainability, something that drops the bottom line for shareholders, the morally good argument is tougher to advance inside a traditional public company boardroom. It's not impossible, but it's more complicated, and all that takes time. So my question is, and again, this includes you, Ryan, because you spend a lot of time in boardrooms. Where and how can a board make the time to tackle these issues? And at a very practical level, for example, which committee? Is this the whole board and the chair or the lead director brings it forward? And do you have it be facilitated? I can't even imagine having a conversation about, well, there's rumors that we're going to get pressed on Gaza. We need to take a position, or we need to decide to not take a position. Boy, that's going to be a fun 3 hours in the boardroom. So yeah, can you give me some tactical help around that for the people who are like making notes and being like, oh no, what do I do? So any of the three of you, this is not a prepared question, so sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the smart boards do this in offsites. And I think what happens is part of the offsite is going to be like maybe a regular board meeting issues, and other parts are going to be educational. And these tabletop exercises and expanding it to C+1 level people if they're around and things like that, that's a natural place to do it. I mean, I think we can learn some from when activism, hit its high point. Lots of boards had offsites that were, facilitated by lawyers or economists or whatever. And they said, let's say we get an activist event. What do we do? Right. And went through that. And so I think you have a similar thing here where, here's an event that occurs. What do you do? But I think smart boards have kind of done this for a long time. Like, let's say you had a big financial restatement. What do you do? Or, you want to have some kind of game plan and play it out and let people really talk about it in a safe way. It's kind of not in a board meeting. It's kind of off to the side where we're having an educational sort of thing. So I think that's the first pass on this.
Yeah, I agree. It's a set of kind of scenario planning that boards can do. And I agree with the offsite idea. The other possible take on this is to ask management to do the initial take on the scenario planning, because management will know the details a lot better and then come to the board or the board offsite with here are the scenarios we thought through, here are the options, and then the board is giving input on top of that. So it's not like you have to start with absolute ground zero as a board. The management can put some thought into it, which then reduces board time. Spending a few hours on this at an offsite thinking through possible scenarios is going to be way less time than the daily, weekly meetings you're going to have if something blows up and you didn't have a plan for it, which we've all been through, right? So that's how I think about it. There's an exercise that I learned from General McChrystal that they use in the military that I think could be good for boards, where they do risk analysis. They think about this situation and everybody thinks of the worst possible things that could happen. And they brainstorm all those things. And then they each rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 for how likely they would be and how bad they would be if they happen. And then they only focus in on the 5 5s or the 4 4s, the things that are very likely and very bad. And because when you scenario plan, you could plan on every possible scenario. So that's one interesting way boards could narrow down what to scenario plan on in the first place.
We call those doom, gloom, boom sessions. Like, so
yeah.
like you try to figure out and then again, you focus on that. That's a really great suggestion. Hey, Ryan, I'm about to move to the kind of, is it the beginning of the end with the Tesla decision? But I want to put you on the spot, and you can totally just pass on this, but I know from your practice area, and I also know because of how comp committees work, sometimes there's a really complex thing they're trying to do, and you just need more time from them, either from the chair of the committee or otherwise. Do you have techniques that you've used successfully to get boards to lean in on hard topics that are going to take them more time? So Dave's strategy is very sensible, which is you do these on offsite retreats, you build it in, you get some big consultants. But what about in little bites? Have you had a successful technique that gets boards to lean in on the topic?
Trying to force in-person meetings to me has been really critical. I mean, post-COVID, I've had a lot of clients realize it's cheaper to keep Ryan at home and look at him vis-a-vis Zoom than it is to fly him out and put him in a hotel. And but I have found in live in-person meetings, the attention span, everybody has a voice. It tends to be those types of meetings where these complex issues are largely solved and addressed. And I find when you try to get on an hour or a 2-hour board Zoom meeting, it will largely be one person potentially monopolizing the conversation and, and this kind of goes back to that super director, I think, and that dynamic between, how much power does a super director have in a room? I think when you get in person, you take some of those barriers down a little bit. So really, when we have real complex issues with my clients from the compensation side, my first response is usually let's get together in person and discuss this and bring the board together in person to the extent possible to discuss this. I think we've lost a little bit of that in this post-COVID world, and I think the in-person meeting, the touch and the feel of that is extremely important when you're dealing with sensitive issues from a compensation perspective.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, there's some very practical strategic things that matter the most, and Dave will appreciate this. Whether it's Value Act, now more than a decade saying basically it's the board book, dummy, like the board book, change the board book. It makes all the difference, right? And to your point, Ryan, if you got hard things, they're new, complicated, meet in person. In person matters, so little things like that. I appreciate that very much. Well, let me shift gears, keep us moving to try to get to at least the last 2 things we promised, and that is CEO pay packages, the role of the comp committee. It's almost obligatory at the moment to mention the Tesla case. Some people are decrying the beginning of the end of any sort of shareholder importance. It's we're all going to move to Texas. Okay, frame that for us a little bit, would you? I mean, all 3 of us know, or all 4 of us know a fair bit, but Ryan, maybe give us a framing and whether or not this is as hot of a topic as we think it is, or it's just an ongoing thing to pay attention.
So I think the Tesla case really calls a few things into question. I think first being, independence of the board, independence of the comp committee. I think that was kind of the catalyst behind some of the pushback that at the time that compensation package was approved by shareholders, some of the constituents on the board, some of the underlying emails back and forth insinuated lack of independence. So again, be careful what you put in writing. I would also recommend pick up a phone and call somebody and talk about it over the phone. There's a lot less discoverable on a phone conversation than there is vis-a-vis email. But I also think, the real crux of this Elon Musk thing, and I think some of what you're seeing in terms of shareholders voting to approve it and then it being shot down by courts, just comes back simply to the magnitude of the award. I think, people just have a hard time wrapping their head around $50+ billion of executive compensation. And I think that to me is the crux. Because I think now when you look at, the voting, the shareholders have gone through it, they did vote for it. I think it's the magnitude that is really causing the heartache. I know they're going to try to restructure some sort of go forward compensation package to make Elon whole as part of this process. But, to me, it really underscores the process by which a comp committee gets from point A to point B on an incentive design program, and really make sure, again, it's done in a truly independent way, that it, can hold water when it's scrutinized, unlike in this instance. But, is it the beginning of the end? I don't think so. I mean, again, I've seen a lot of, what I would call mega packages for founder CEOs or high flying CEOs. They usually pale from a dollar comparison in terms of what Elon had received. But again, in all of those instances, they've got to be very thoughtful. They've got to be mutually beneficial, obviously, to the shareholder and the executive. And to some extent, the Tesla one was, because it did create a tremendous boon from a market cap perspective. But again, I think when you come back, it's just the dollar magnitude that, with all of this other additional scrutiny around executive pay being out of whack and those kind of things, I just think that rhetoric was a bit too strong in this instance.
I'm going to ask Dave to weigh in briefly before we jump to the next topic. But so just to summarize, Ryan, on the one hand, the quantum itself is sort of the outlier red herring here. It's just so big that it's tight. But I do think the emphasis on process and process signaling independence and process being protective of the, discretion and the decision-making of the board. That's not a hot topic. That's just always the topic, right? I jokingly said to someone, I said, I think I want to make a t-shirt that says, don't do drugs, but if you do, don't do them with your CEO. That would lessen the issues that might, impact independence. But Dave, I know you have a view on the Tesla thing, and I want to give you like 1 minute to do it before we hop into the kind of work from home stuff.
Yeah, I realized we were going to talk about microdosing, but maybe that's a topic for next year. But the Tesla thing, I find it fascinating. I'll try to be very quick here. From an economic standpoint, pure economics, it just seemed like a fine contract. It's kind of a winner-take-all industry, and it could have easily ended up at zero. And may still. I mean, he has to hold those options for quite a while, and we'll see. But from a societal or psychological or whatever perspective, I mean, 60 billion is a big number. And is anybody worth that? Ryan has dealt with these issues forever in comp consulting and since it's a social choice that is made. I would say the legal opinion I found to be interesting to read, but I mean, from her perspective, it's kind of like, well, he should work for zero, and he doesn't need any more incentives. I don't think that's smart. And I think the legal opinion got a little out over its skis, where it's saying, well, trust me, he's got the right incentives, and it's like a lawyer talking about very deep sort of issues. So the short answer is it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. My guess is it's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. And to be just completely clear, I worked on some of the litigation here, so I'm not, I think I understand it. But
we might say you're very informed, but perhaps not unbiased. So that's
yes. Let me say that. Yeah.
We like that.
I mean, the thing that I don't understand is, for him, as you said, for him to get this, everybody has to do well, right? And so that's why it was a shocking ruling to me. I mean, I get that the amount is very large, and I think the learning for companies, and I'm sure people like Ryan can help, is how you talk about it and how you frame these things such that you don't get stuck in this kind of hot water over what is presumably.
It's pretty hard to frame 60 billion, but Ryan, please do it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I can frame 60 billion, but to your point, Jen, it was a win-win. And when you look at it from a structural standpoint and you step back on it and you say, I can understand the consultant or the catalyst behind the program, because it was, and to Dave's point, the floor of this is zero, right? It wasn't, so there were degrees of, and it was certainly a heavily performance driven award.
The ultimate performance comp contract.
So,
and also approved by shareholders. So it's almost like
approved by shareholders.
None of you know what you're talking about, which I personally dislike, but neither here.
Yeah. I think it sets somewhat of an uncomfortable precedent, but I think again, when you come back, it's, kind of this societal thing that Dave was alluding to, and you just see $60 billion being tied to an incentive package for a CEO. It elicits emotions that I think are, maybe you take the fact out of it and just kind of look at the number and go, that doesn't seem right. So I think you're getting some of that bias. Yeah, decision making.
Real quick, I mean, there's also the issue of how much the board members were paid at Tesla, and it sort of, the look from the outside, it seemed unusual. So, but that's being litigated as well. So.
And that's the shame. In theory, such an elegant win-win proposal and contract that arguably did all the things you wanted to do. The process and the optics were flawed in a way that doesn't allow it to come to be. So that if there's a governance miss there, perhaps it's that. So we have, as we often do, had such a good time. We've run out of time. So I'm going to ask my final question, which is the one thing that you think that directors that are listening should really keep in mind moving forward. We didn't get to the work from home thing. You can choose to comment on that if you want, but take 30, 45 seconds to say, okay, listen, whatever else you do, you should think about this or do this. Maybe you already mentioned, or maybe we didn't get a chance to mention it. Why don't we try to do that? I'm going to start with Ryan, then I'll go Dave, and then I'll end with Jen. So Ryan, you go first.
I'll come at it through the compensation lens. Certainly, again, there's a lot of rhetoric amongst boards that performance-based equity is the end-all, be-all in terms of kind of form and function of executive long-term incentive. I think you're starting to see that rhetoric change a little bit with proxy advisory firms and institutional shareholders, understanding that setting long-term goals in today's environment is increasingly difficult. And perhaps you would be better suited by longer vesting time-based equity. So, a time-based restricted stock that has been accustomed to vesting, let's say over a 3-year period, maybe is a 5-year vesting period to really accentuate the long-term focus, but to also move away from this need to set definitive goals that are often leading to discretionary adjustments or things that companies have to disclose in a proxy, and puts the comp committee in kind of a precarious spot that they have to make, a discretionary decision outside of the bounds of kind of the quantitative plan.
That deserves its own session entirely. Pendulum swings. Okay, I like that. Yeah. Dave, your turn.
Yeah, real quick. I think every board is struggling with AI and how it's being used, and mostly how it's being used in the company, in terms of call centers or engineering or coding or whatever. I think we're going to see going forward that the AI tools are going to be used by the board members in doing their work. And if you look out there in the companies that do electronic board books and that, they're appending AI tools where things that are hard to do as a board member. It's like, well, here's what we talked about this today. What did we talk about it 2-3 years ago? Is it the same dialogue? And AI is going to be able to bring that forward and actually even suggest questions like, hey, I see you're looking at, Ryan's comp report. Is there other ways to benchmark it or things like that? So I think the AI tools are going to really help out, but it remains to be seen. I don't think it's the scary part of AI. I think it's really things that could, generate some efficiency and productivity in the boardroom.
I see a startup in your future, Dave Larker.
Maybe.
So Jen, you get final word.
Yeah, I agree. It was AI that's top of mind for me. And I do agree with David that it'll make board members better and more efficient at their jobs. I also think it is creating a whole new level of risk, both benefit and risk. So a huge amount of benefit to the company. And I think boards should be pressing to make sure that their companies are staying up to speed and with the latest of AI, or else they will have major risk of falling behind. So it's sort of risk on both sides. If you don't do it, you will be left in the dust, your company completely. And if you do it, there's a lot of risk there. It's kind of like taking the cybersecurity risk we've been managing up until now, and times 100 with all the bad things that could happen. So I think board members need to get really well educated on AI quickly.
That's great. Well, we are, as is often the case, out of time, and I wish we could have gotten the other things. I feel like we need a part 2, which we'll consider if you guys are willing to show up again. But I want to end with just thanking you so much for a wonderful discussion. We actually addressed the questions indirectly, and we look forward to talking to you again. And thanks everyone for spending an hour with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.